On the morning of January the 21st, 1924, in a snow-covered mansion in the village of Gorki, some 30 kilometers south of Moscow, the man who had seized power in Russia 7 years earlier and transformed it into the world's first socialist state, lay dying. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 53 years old, his body ravaged by a series of catastrophic strokes, was entering his final hours. The revolutionary who had overthrown the Romanov dynasty, dismantled the Russian Empire, and ignited a global ideological conflict that would define the 20th century, was now a prisoner in his own failing body, unable to speak, barely able to move, his once formidable intellect trapped behind eyes that could no longer communicate the thoughts within. To understand the significance of these final 24 hours, we must recognize what Lenin had become by January 1924. He was not merely a political leader. He was the living embodiment of the Bolshevik Revolution, the architect of Soviet power, the man whose decisions had led to civil war, famine, terror, and the establishment of a one-party dictatorship that claimed to represent the workers of the world. His death would not simply create a vacancy at the top of the Soviet hierarchy. It would unleash a succession struggle that would reshape the Soviet Union and determine the fate of millions. The events of January 21st were not just the end of one man's life. They were the beginning of a new and darker chapter in Soviet history. Lenin's decline had been neither sudden nor unexpected. In May 1922, he had suffered his first major stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. By December of that year, he was largely confined to his quarters, dictating what would become known as his testament, a series of reflections on the future of the party and assessments of his potential successors. In March 1923 came the third stroke, the one that would prove irreversible. This attack destroyed his ability to speak entirely. The man who had commanded audiences with his oratory, who had written volumes of political theory, who had directed the machinery of revolution through the force of his words, was rendered mute. Partial paralysis seized his right side. He developed sensory aphasia, a cruel condition in which the ability to understand language itself begins to fragment and dissolve. For a time, in the spring and early summer of 1923, there appeared to be hope. Lenin showed signs of recovery. He regained some mobility, learned to walk again with assistance, and slowly recovered fragments of his speech and writing ability. By October, he felt strong enough to make one final visit to the Kremlin, the seat of Soviet power, the fortress from which he had directed the transformation of Russia. It was a symbolic journey, a dying man's return to the center of his life's work. But it was also a farewell. After that October visit, Lenin would never leave Gorki again. The Gorki estate, formerly owned by a wealthy industrialist, had been converted into a residence for Lenin during his illness. It was here, in this quiet mansion surrounded by birch forests and snow-covered fields, that the leader of world communism spent his final months. The isolation was both medical and political. His doctors insisted on rest and limited visitors. But the isolation also served the interests of those maneuvering for power in Moscow. With Lenin incapacitated, unable to speak or effectively communicate, the struggle for succession intensified. Joseph Stalin, appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in April 1922, had been consolidating his control over the party apparatus. Leon Trotsky, the brilliant organizer of the Red Army and the second most prominent Bolshevik leader, found himself increasingly marginalized. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, both old Bolsheviks and members of the Politburo, were aligning themselves with Stalin against Trotsky. Nikolai Bukharin, the party's leading theoretician, was trying to navigate between factions. In his final weeks, Lenin received visits from several of these men. Zinoviev came to Gorki, so did Kamenev. Bukharin visited multiple times, including on the final day of Lenin's life. These visits were ostensibly gestures of respect and concern for the ailing leader, but they were also something else. They were reconnaissance missions, attempts to gauge Lenin's condition, to be seen at his bedside, to position oneself as the loyal disciple in the eyes of history. Each visitor knew that Lenin's death was imminent. Each was calculating how that death would affect his own position in the coming struggle. What none of them could know with certainty was what Lenin himself thought of them in these final days. His testament, dictated in December 1922 and early January 1923, had offered assessments of the leading Bolsheviks. He had warned that Stalin had concentrated too much power in his hands and suggested that the party find a way to remove him from the position of General Secretary. He had praised Trotsky's abilities while criticizing his excessive self-confidence. He had noted the October 1917 episode when Zinoviev and Kamenev had opposed the armed insurrection, suggesting this should not be held against them, but clearly remembering their moment of weakness. But by January 1924, Lenin could no longer speak. Whatever final judgments he might have rendered, whatever warnings he might have issued, died with him unspoken. The events of January 21st unfolded with the inexorable rhythm of tragedy. Lenin had been in declining health throughout the preceding weeks. The partial recovery of mid-1923 had proven temporary. By January, he was bedridden, his condition deteriorating. Bukharin's visit that day was likely understood by both men, in whatever way Lenin could still understand, to be a final farewell. Then, at some point during the day, Lenin fell into a coma. His body, already weakened by multiple strokes, by the vascular disease that had been destroying his brain for years, finally began to shut down. There was no dramatic deathbed scene, no final words of wisdom or warning. There was only the slow cessation of biological function, the fading of consciousness, and then, later that day, death. The official cause was recorded as an incurable disease of the blood vessels. This was accurate as far as it went. Modern medical analysis of Lenin's symptoms and the subsequent examination of his brain confirms that he suffered from severe cerebral arteriosclerosis, a hardening and narrowing of the arteries supplying blood to the brain. The condition had caused the series of strokes that progressively destroyed his neurological function. Some historians have speculated about other contributing factors, including the possibility of syphilis or the long-term effects of the assassination attempt in August 1918, when Fanny Kaplan shot him, leaving bullets lodged near his spine and neck. But the immediate cause was clear enough. Lenin's brain had been starved of blood, his neurons dying by the millions. Until the damage was incompatible with life. The Soviet government did not announce Lenin's death immediately. There was a delay of one day until January 22nd, before the public was informed. This gap is significant. It gave the leadership time to coordinate their response, to ensure that the announcement was made in a controlled manner, and to begin implementing the plans for what would come next. When the announcement finally came, it sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union and the world. Lenin was not merely a national leader. He was the founding figure of the communist movement, the man who had proven that Marxist revolution was possible, that a workers' state could be established and defended. His death meant uncertainty both for the Soviet Union and for communist movements worldwide. On January 23rd, the process of transforming Lenin from a man into a symbol began in earnest. Mourners from the Communist Party, from trade unions, and from local Soviets traveled to Gorki to view the body. This was not a private affair. It was a state ritual, carefully choreographed to demonstrate the unity of the Soviet system and the seamless transition of power. Lenin's body was placed in a red coffin, the color of revolution, of blood, of the Bolshevik flag. Leading members of the party carried the coffin, a symbolic act that associated them with Lenin's legacy and legitimized their own positions in the hierarchy. Every gesture was calculated, every image was propaganda. The body was then transported by train to Moscow, a journey that became a funeral procession. The coffin was taken to the House of Trade Unions, a grand neoclassical building in the center of Moscow that had once been the club of the nobility in Tsarist times. Here, Lenin's body was laid in state, and here the true magnitude of his impact became visible. Over the next 3 days, approximately 1 million people came to pay their respects. They queued for hours in temperatures well below freezing, standing in lines that stretched through the streets of Moscow. Many of these mourners were true believers, communists who saw Lenin as the liberator of the working class, the man who had given them hope for a better world. Others came out of duty or fear, understanding that absence might be noted, that failing to mourn publicly could mark one as politically suspect. Still, others came out of simple curiosity, to see with their own eyes the man who had changed their world so completely. The scale of the mourning was unprecedented in Soviet history. Nothing like it had been seen before. The regime mobilized its entire propaganda apparatus to shape the narrative of Lenin's death, and to ensure that his passing was understood not as an ending, but as a transition, a passing of the torch to the collective leadership of the party. On January the 26th, the 11th All-Union Congress of Soviets convened to pay official respects. Speeches were delivered by Mikhail Kalinin, the titular head of state, by Zinoviev, and by Stalin. Each speaker praised Lenin's contributions, pledged loyalty to his vision, and committed to continuing his work. The speeches were exercises in political positioning, each man using the occasion to associate himself with Lenin's authority and to stake his claim to leadership. Notably absent from these proceedings was Leon Trotsky, the man who had been Lenin's closest collaborator during the Revolution and Civil War, who had organized the Red Army and led it to victory against the Whites, who was widely regarded as the second most important figure in the Soviet state, was not in Moscow for Lenin's funeral. Trotsky was convalescing in the Caucasus, recovering from illness. He would later claim that Stalin had sent him a telegram with the incorrect date of the funeral, making it impossible for him to return to Moscow in time. Whether this was deliberate sabotage by Stalin or a genuine miscommunication remains a matter of historical debate. But the effect was clear. Trotsky's absence from Lenin's funeral was a propaganda disaster for him and a coup for his rivals. It allowed Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev to position themselves as the true inheritors of Lenin's legacy, while Trotsky appeared indifferent or disloyal. Lenin's funeral took place on January 27th. His body was carried to Red Square, the vast open plaza adjacent to the Kremlin that had become the symbolic heart of Soviet power. The procession was accompanied by martial music, by the somber rhythms of military bands playing funeral marches. Tens of thousands of people assembled in the square despite temperatures that remained brutally cold. They listened to a series of speeches, more eulogies, more pledges of loyalty to Lenin's vision. Then the coffin was placed into a temporary wooden mausoleum that had been hastily constructed on Red Square. The mausoleum was positioned against the Kremlin wall, ensuring that Lenin would remain at the center of Soviet power even in death. The decision to preserve Lenin's body was controversial from the beginning. Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's widow, protested against it. She understood that her husband had been a materialist, an atheist, a man who had spent his life fighting against religious superstition and the cult of personality. The idea of embalming his body and putting it on permanent display was antithetical to everything Lenin had claimed to believe. It transformed him into a secular saint, a holy relic of the new Soviet religion. But Krupskaya's objections were overruled. The decision to embalm Lenin was made by the collective leadership, and it reflected their understanding of what the Soviet Union needed. Lenin alive had been a leader. Lenin dead could be a god. The embalming process was a technical marvel and a grotesque undertaking. Lenin's body was treated with chemicals to halt decomposition and preserve the tissues. His brain was removed for separate study. In 1925, an entire institute was established with the sole purpose of dissecting and analyzing Lenin's brain. The scientists were searching for the biological basis of genius, for some physical explanation of Lenin's intellectual abilities. What they found instead was evidence of the disease that had killed him. Lenin's brain showed severe sclerosis, extensive damage to the blood vessels, and significant tissue death. The organ that had conceived the Bolshevik Revolution had been dying for years. The temporary wooden mausoleum was always intended to be replaced. In July 1929, the Politburo authorized the construction of a permanent structure in granite. The new mausoleum was completed in 1933, a severe modernist pyramid that embodied the aesthetic of Soviet power. It was imposing, monumental, and utterly devoid of ornament or warmth. Lenin's body was moved into this new tomb, encased in a glass sarcophagus that allowed visitors to view the preserved corpse. The sarcophagus itself was replaced in 1940, and again in 1970, each time using more advanced materials and preservation techniques. During the Second World War, when Nazi forces threatened Moscow, Lenin's body was evacuated for safety. From 1941 to 1945, it was kept in Tyumen, a city in western Siberia, far from the front lines. Even in the midst of total war, with millions dying and the survival of the Soviet Union itself in question, resources were devoted to protecting Lenin's corpse. This fact alone demonstrates the symbolic importance that the preserved body had acquired. Lenin was no longer a man. He was the foundation myth of the Soviet state, the physical proof of the revolution's legitimacy. The succession struggle that Lenin's death unleashed would determine the course of Soviet history for decades. Stalin, using his control of the party apparatus, gradually outmaneuvered his rivals. Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1927 and exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929. He would be assassinated by a Soviet agent in Mexico in 1940. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had allied with Stalin against Trotsky, later opposed Stalin's policies and were executed during the Great Purge in 1936. Bukharin, who had been Lenin's favorite and the party's leading theorist, was also executed in 1938 after a show trial. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin had eliminated virtually every old Bolshevik who had worked with Lenin, consolidating a personal dictatorship that would have been unthinkable during Lenin's lifetime. The question of continuity between Lenin and Stalin remains one of the most contested issues in Soviet historiography. Stalin claimed to be Lenin's faithful disciple, implementing Leninism in practice. His critics, both at the time and since, have argued that Stalin betrayed Lenin's legacy, that the terror and dictatorship of the Stalin era represented a fundamental departure from Lenin's vision. The truth is more complex. Lenin had established the foundations of the Soviet system, the one-party state, the secret police, the labor camps, the suppression of dissent, the use of terror as a political tool. Stalin built on these foundations, expanding and systematizing them, but he did not invent them. The seeds of Stalinism were present in Leninism from the beginning. Lenin's body remains on public display in the mausoleum on Red Square to this day. Visitors can still queue to view the preserved corpse, to see the physical remains of the man who changed the 20th century. The body has been maintained through decades of careful preservation work, a grotesque monument to the Soviet experiment. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there were periodic calls to remove Lenin's body from Red Square and give it a proper burial. Some argued that maintaining the mausoleum was an expensive anachronism, a relic of a discredited ideology. Others contended that Lenin's body was part of Russian history and should be preserved as such. The debate continues, but the body remains a physical link to a vanished world. The final 24 hours of Vladimir Lenin's life were the end of an era and the beginning of another. The revolutionary who had seized power in October 1917 died in January 1924, but the system he created survived him by nearly 7 decades. The Soviet Union that emerged from Lenin's death was shaped by the succession struggle, by Stalin's triumph, by the transformation of Lenin from leader to icon. The consequences of those final hours in Gorki rippled outward through history, affecting the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the globe. The Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the division of Europe, the communist movements in Asia and Latin America all trace their origins back to the revolution that Lenin led and the state that he founded. His death did not end that story. It merely opened a new chapter, one written in the blood of purges and famines, of world war and ideological conflict. Lenin's final day was not an ending. It was a transformation, the moment when a man became a myth, and a myth became the justification for decades of tyranny.